Yes, is David Azerrad, and David is the director of the Simon Center, B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics, the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity, and he's a subject matter expert. Welcome to the program from Heritage Foundation, David Azerrad.
Thank you, Lonnie, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you at the Black Conservative Summit. As a conservative, I've always been intrigued by that word. Imagine you were to meet someone who speaks English but isn't very familiar with our political culture. And you tell him, "Hi, I'm David, and I'm a conservative." He would say, "Conservative? What does that mean?" And you would say, "Well, I believe in free enterprise and limited government and religious liberty, in strong families and vibrant civil society, and in a strong national defense." He'd say, "Okay, but then why don't you just say so? Why do you call yourself a conservative? What are you trying to conserve?" That's a very interesting question, and it's one I think that we conservatives don't think about very often. Because we're busy, we're living our lives, we're tending to our families, we're involved in our communities, and we're involved in these day-to-day pressing political issues. But what are we trying to conserve? So we're not only, before I give you my answer, I want to make clear, we're not just backwards looking and trying to conserve things in the past. There's a very real sense, I think, in which we're a forward-looking movement. We look to the future. We're not trying to return to some mythical past that was wonderful as conservatives. We have our eyes set on the future. To quote what I think is the most beautiful line in all the Constitution, which, by the way, turned 227 years old last week, our aim as conservatives is, quote, "to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." It's not just for us as conservatives. We are looking to the future, to the posterity, and we want to make sure that subsequent generations also are capable of enjoying the blessings of liberty in this great land of opportunity. So we embrace progress. We do not oppose change. I mean, quite the contrary. Think of how we're clamoring for change. Change to our education system, change to the economy, change to the way that government works. But ultimately, it is true that we are trying to conserve something. And what are we trying to conserve as conservatives? My answer, and this is an American answer, people say, "What sort of a conservative are you?" There are theocons, neocons, crunchycons, paleocons. I say, I'm an American. What I want to conserve is America. I think as conservatives, our fundamental project is to conserve the regime of ordered liberty established by our founders. The American conservative idea is devoted to the American idea: life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, government by consent. Now, at this point, our interlocutor would say, "Okay, so this is what you're trying to conserve as a conservative, but how can you be a black conservative? Weren't the founders racist? Didn't they own slaves?" This is the question I'd like to take up with you today. And I think it's a very important question, because I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that for many people, when they hear the founding, slavery is the first thing that comes to their mind. And it is often the very first charge that is used to discredit the founding. Sanford Levinson, who's an important, fairly prominent law professor at UT Austin, he wrote a book called Our Undemocratic Constitution. And on page 4, it doesn't wait very long, he says, "Our 18th century ancestors had little trouble integrating slavery into their conception of a, quote, republican political order. That vision of politics is blessedly long behind us, but the Constitution is not," end quote. The following statement by MSNBC's, is he still on MSNBC, Keith Olbermann? No, I think he's gone, right? Well, at one time he was, and he said this on the air. I think it sums up the view of many Americans. "Not very many of the founding fathers were evolved enough to believe that black people were actually people. The founding fathers thought that they were slaves and fought hard to make sure that they would always remain slaves," end quote. Now, I'm no fan of Keith Olbermann, and I think that this indictment is grotesque. But the question of race and slavery is a very real problem when we think about the founding. To put it simply, how could a nation conceived in liberty, as Lincoln put it, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, tolerate the existence of race-based chattel slavery? How could men be denied their God-given natural rights simply because of the color of their skin? This is a very important question, and I found it useful to address it by breaking it down into three components. One is to look at the principles of the founding. Second is to look at the private deeds of the founders and their private lives. And third is to look at the Constitution, our premier political document. So let's begin with the principles upon which America was founded. Were the ideals of the Declaration of Independence racist? Did they perhaps in any way promote or sanction or countenance slavery? I think the answer is quite simple on this one. It is an unambiguous and resounding no. When the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, it means all human beings, regardless of skin color, religion, race, gender, you name it. All men means all men. Nowhere in our founding documents, nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere in the Declaration are human beings classified according to skin color. Race is not a category that exists insofar as the core principles that define the nation are concerned. And it therefore follows that if all men are created equal, and that their skin color doesn't matter insofar as the principles that define their humanity are concerned, slavery is a moral abomination, and that it is fundamentally wrong to do that. All the founders knew this. Time and time and time again, in public speeches and in private letters, the point was made that a nation that defined itself in terms of natural human equality was in fundamental violation with its own principles by having slavery. We may say, well, listen, talk is cheap, but we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss Jefferson's foresight in putting that statement at the heart of the Declaration of Independence. Here's the situation in America in 1774, at the beginning of the Revolution. There is slavery in every single one of the colonies. The slave trade is going on with Africa, and there was not a single abolitionist society in all of America. Fast forward to 1830, 2 generations later. Slavery has practically been abolished in the North. Less than 1% of the 125,000 northern blacks were slaves. The Northwest Ordinance has made slavery illegal in the entire Northwestern territories, and the slave trade with Africa has been abolished. Now, in the South, of course, slavery endured, and we needed a bloody civil war to abolish it. But we cannot discount the importance of this idea and how it started to have real-world consequences. So, as far as the principles are concerned, I don't think this is a contentious point. Race is not a category insofar as America's core principles are concerned. Now, let's look at the founders themselves in their private lives. Did Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, Adams, when it came to how they led their lives, did they live up to these principles? I think this is an interesting and important question, but it ultimately doesn't bear on the question that we're examining. When I turn to the principles of the founding for guidance, when you do, I'm not looking into how Jefferson lived his private life. I'm looking at the principles that we publicly embraced as a nation. Jefferson owned slaves. Shame on him. Hamilton never owned slaves, to his great credit. Hamilton cheated on his wife. That does not make philandering a founding principle. So the founders are all long dead and gone. So they did certain good things, they did certain bad things, and they did certain undistinguishable things. The political principles which they articulated endured, and racism and slavery are most emphatically not among them. Let's now turn to wrap things up to the Constitution. And this is where we confront the most difficult question. So if you agree with me so far that the Declaration doesn't speak of race and that all men means all men, then why didn't they get rid of slavery? How do you account for this? How do we account for this massive contradiction? The short answer, and it has to be a short answer, is that the Southern slaveholding interests would have never ratified a constitution that outlawed slavery. In fact, they wouldn't even sign on to Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, since it condemned the slave trade. So what did they do? They compromised. They created a constitution that accepts slavery as a fait accompli, underscores the humanity of the slaves, thereby denying the claim that they were mere property, and empowers the federal government to hem it in and hopefully one day eradicate it through a constitutional amendment. Had the founders refused to compromise, what we would have had is no union, no constitution, and therefore no possibility to ever get rid of this wretched institution. So how does the Constitution then deal with slavery? On the one hand, its principles are opposed to it. On the other hand, it has to recognize its existence. One thing you see is that the word slave is never used in the Constitution. There are no references to slave or to slavery. Slaves are referred to as other persons. It's a euphemism, true, but they're referred to as persons. And this is an important point because it fundamentally denies the claim that certain human beings can be property. The Constitution also makes clear that slavery is a state institution. It's not an institution that is promoted and embraced by the Constitution itself at the national level. Therefore, when slavery was finally abolished by the 13th Amendment, not one word of the Constitution had to be changed. Now, what about the 3/5 clause? The infamous 3/5 clause. What does it say? It says that for purposes of taxation and representation, each state is going to count up all its citizens and then add what? 3/5 of all other persons. Black citizens, and there were many, counted as one for purposes of representation and taxation. In fact, this is a little known fact that free blacks were voting in a majority of states at the time of the founding. Now, not in very large numbers, and regrettably, as the decades went forward, they started to be disenfranchised. But it is a fact that there were free blacks voting at the time of the founding. It is the South that wanted to count the slaves as one. Why? Because it would give them more voices in Congress. It would give them more power in Congress. It was the Northerners who said, hold on one second. You say when it comes to slavery, they're treated as property, but suddenly when it comes to political representation, you want to count them as citizens? You can't do that. So they arrived at this 3/5 compromise. It says nothing about the moral worth of black people. It's, pardon me? Oh. What it ultimately did is that it weakened Southern representation in Congress. What else? Congress had the power to outlaw the slave trade within 20 years. And they did so on the very first day that they could. January 1st, 1808, Jefferson signed the law into action. It gave Congress the power to ban slavery and the importation of slaves in all the new territories and states. It gave Congress the power to tax slave owners and to make it unprofitable. And of course, the Constitution could be amended. This was the hope that one day you would have a supermajority of free states and you would finally get rid of slavery. And for all these reasons, Frederick Douglass concluded that the Constitution is a glorious document of liberty. So I would put to you in conclusion, the standard take on the question of slavery, race, and the founding fails to do justice to the complexity of the issue and does not acknowledge the real efforts that were made to undermine slavery. None of this is meant to whitewash the founding or in any way to minimize the horrors of slavery and the permanent stain that it has left on our history. Nor does it imply that we should not be investigating the historical record and asking some tough questions. Did the founders do enough? Could they not have pushed harder? Could they not have tried to limit the importation of slaves, not wait 20 years, say 10 years or 5 years? These are legitimate questions. What we cannot do, we should ask these questions. What we cannot do is complacently dismiss the founding and its principles as being racist and pro-slavery. And I have a great story that I'd like to tell you. All of you know about Frederick Douglass, who's one of my absolute favorite Americans. And he started off as a radical abolitionist. He was hanging out with William Lloyd Garrison and this crowd. And their argument was the Constitution is a pact with the devil, and they would publicly burn it. And he thought that we should scrap the entirety of the founding. And then he opens up his own newspaper, and he needs to start thinking about these things really, not just relying on received opinions. And he starts to look into the historical record. And you know what is the conclusion that Douglass comes to? That actually the principles of the founding are on his side. And he continuously invokes them to justify the abolitionist cause, and then after the war to clamor for the rights of the emancipated slaves. It wasn't just Douglass who recognized that the principles of the founding apply to all men and all women. Martin Luther King saw this too. We all know about the dream, right? I have a dream, and what this dream consists of. We tend to forget that according to Dr. King, where does this dream come from? He says, it is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. It is embedded in the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So I would leave you with this choice. I would leave all of us with this choice. When we need to make up our minds on where do we stand of this question of race, slavery, and the founding. On the one hand, we can stand, as I do, with Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist of the 19th century, and Dr. Martin Luther King, the greatest civil rights leader of the 20th century, who both realized that in their struggles, the founding principles were on their side. Or we can agree with the likes of Justice Taney, who ruled in Dred Scott, which is arguably the worst Supreme Court decision in the history of this country, that all men actually only applies to white people. I would suggest that there's something wrong with all of us if we end up in the latter camp. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions for David? Dr. Trey?
Thank you. One of my experiences on the campaign trail is in trying to address this issue with the Three-Fifths Compromise. And one thing I acknowledge, maybe I didn't articulate it as eloquently as you did or Dr. Ben did, but I get this knee-jerk reaction sometimes from white folks that as I'm trying to articulate a defense of the Constitution and understand or articulate the reason why we need to support the Constitution and embrace the Constitution as black people and not allow this negative deception to go on because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, it's like, well, he's talking about it, so he might be one of those who are trying to perpetuate this deception. So how do we address the knee-jerk reaction to get folks to really hear us through that we're embracing the Constitution, defending it, and not one of those who are trying to attack it because of this?
I don't know. It's a difficult question. I don't have a simple answer because you asked a very good question. I don't think we should shy away from it because I think the stakes are very high in this question. It's not just a historical question, right, that is of interest to historians. What this debate is fundamentally about is, are we telling our fellow black Americans that they belong in America? That at their root they can become Americans? Or are we saying that, look, at the end of the day, this country is fundamentally, there's no room for you here? The ramifications of this go very, very far. Either you foster a sense of integration or one of alienation. So it's a very difficult question to address, and the historical record is not pretty. I want to be clear, I'm not trying to whitewash it. But the principles, I think, are unambiguously clear, and I think we should stick at it because it's not just a historical question, but I think an important political question.
Yes. One more question?
Yes, ma'am?
Thank you. It's not a question. I just wondered if you would be kind to share your notes.
Sure. There you go.
I think they were very well articulated, and I think well, you don't have to give me these. Whoa. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Yeah, I was going to say that very thing. Your talking points and the data are very important to everyone in this room, including myself, because I get thrown that about the Three-Fifths Compromise, and the left has really twisted that thing to mean something that it didn't really originally intend to be. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Ronnie.